She was a queen, a widow, and eventually the matriarch of an empire that stretched across the globe. To the world she was Queen Victoria, the woman whose reign defined an entire age, but to those who knew her most closely, she was a daughter, a wife, a grieving widow, and a mother who never stopped feeling the weight of her own losses. Her life was not only about crowns, parades, and ceremonies. It was about love, heartbreak, and endurance. It was about how a woman who seemed broken by grief found ways to transform herself into a figure larger than life, shaping the monarchy we still see today. Victoria's reign began with light and promise. In 1837, she was just 18 years old when she placed the crown on her head. Few believed this spirited young woman would rule with strength, and yet, from the beginning, she showed a determination to govern with independence. She quickly proved her critics wrong, leaning on the advice of her ministers and, more importantly, the steady presence of her beloved husband, Prince Albert. Their partnership changed everything. Albert was not only her consort, but her most trusted counselor, her equal, and her closest friend. Together they built an image of monarchy that felt intimate and relatable. The sight of them walking with their children or sharing moments of affection made the royal family appear more human than ever before. But when Albert died in 1861, everything changed. For Victoria, the crown became a burden almost too heavy to bear. Her grief was consuming, and she withdrew from public life. She dressed in black, surrounded herself with reminders of Albert, and turned Windsor Castle into a shrine to his memory. She even kept his clothes laid out each day, as though he might return. For her people, once filled with admiration, patience began to wear thin. Newspapers mocked her absence. Some wondered if the monarchy could survive a queen who no longer appeared before them. The nation faced a strange contradiction. A queen who seemed both ever-present in symbol but absent in duty. And yet, out of this darkness came a transformation. Victoria's mourning years reshaped the monarchy. She discovered new ways to rule, not through constant presence, but through carefully chosen appearances, symbolic gestures, and the growing reach of the British Empire. She took on the title Empress of India, appeared to her people as a figure of almost sacred endurance, and became a grandmother whose children married into royal families across Europe. Her private sorrows became the foundation of a public image that would carry the monarchy into the modern age. Victoria's story is filled with contradictions. She was both fragile and formidable, private yet profoundly public, broken by grief yet unshakably strong. Her life reminds us that behind the grandeur of crowns and ceremonies lies a human being whose joys and sorrows shaped the fate of nations. Welcome to our channel Words of Time, and in this video, we will explore the rise of a young queen and the love story that defined her reign. We will uncover the crushing grief that turned her into the Widow of Windsor. We will look at the controversies around John Brown and her transformation into Empress of India. We will trace how her children shaped the dynastic map of Europe. And finally, we will reflect on the Diamond Jubilee and the lasting legacy she left behind. When Prince Albert died in December of 1861, Queen Victoria was only 42 years old. She had been married to him for just over 20 years, and in that time, she had come to see him not only as her husband but as her closest friend, her trusted advisor, and the one person who gave her the strength to endure the weight of the crown. His sudden death from typhoid left her devastated in a way that was almost impossible for her subjects to understand. To her, life without him seemed stripped of purpose. To the country, however, her grief soon became a public matter, for she was not simply a widow. She was the sovereign, and her private despair had lasting consequences for her people and for the institution of the monarchy itself. In the days following Albert's death, Victoria was inconsolable. She wrote in her journal and to her relatives that her life was over. She withdrew to Windsor Castle, dressed in black mourning clothes, and refused to appear in public. She insisted that all servants and court officials wear mourning attire, and the entire atmosphere of the royal household became a shrine to Albert's memory. His rooms were left exactly as he had left them. His clothes, books, and personal possessions remained untouched. Meals were even placed at his empty table setting, as if he might return. To many observers within the family and the court, this was a visible sign of the depth of her attachment. To the wider public, however, this withdrawal quickly began to raise questions about whether the monarch could carry out her duties while so deeply absorbed in private sorrow. For Victoria, grief was not a passing state. She entered into what would become a lifelong mourning. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. She insisted on using the title Widow of Windsor to describe herself, and she repeatedly told her ministers and family that she longed for death. She relied heavily on servants such as John Brown, her Scottish attendant, who became not only a source of comfort but also a controversial figure in the eyes of the public and political class. Her seclusion, though deeply personal, was inevitably interpreted as political. At a time when the monarch was expected to be visible, to preside over ceremonies, and to act as a symbol of national unity, her absence created uncertainty. In the first years after Albert's death, many of her subjects sympathized. The nation understood that she had suffered a terrible loss, and the image of a grieving widow touched many hearts. Yet as months turned into years, sympathy began to turn into impatience. The Queen rarely appeared in London. Public events were left unattended. The annual state opening of Parliament became irregular. The court lost much of its glamour as entertainments, balls, and gatherings were cancelled. The image of the monarchy as a lively center of national life began to fade. The press, which had once celebrated Victoria as the devoted wife and mother, started to criticize her as absent, self-indulgent, and neglectful of duty. This growing dissatisfaction was compounded by the fact that the monarchy in the mid-19th century was already under pressure. Britain was changing rapidly. The expansion of the vote, industrialization, and the rise of a more politically aware middle class meant that people expected their rulers to reflect national progress rather than stand apart from it. With the Queen hidden away in Windsor or Balmoral, the burden of royal visibility fell on others, such as her eldest son, the Prince of Wales. But the prince, later King Edward VII, was often criticized for his playboy lifestyle. His affairs and love of leisure did little to inspire public confidence. In the absence of a visible monarch, some feared that the crown itself might lose its place at the heart of national life. By the late 1860s and early 1870s, criticism grew louder. Satirical magazines such as Punch published cartoons mocking the Queen's absence. Pamphlets and articles accused her of neglecting her responsibilities. Ordinary people began to ask whether Britain still had a functioning monarchy or whether it was ruled instead by ministers and Parliament alone. The Queen's ministers, including Prime Ministers Lord Palmerston and later William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli, found themselves in a delicate position. They had to govern the country, but they also needed the public support that only a visible monarch could help secure. They worried that if Victoria continued to hide, Republican sentiment might grow. This concern was not unfounded. Republican movements did gain traction in the 1870s. Public meetings were held that questioned the cost and purpose of the monarchy. Some newspapers published arguments suggesting that Britain would be better served by a republic. While these movements never reached the level of real revolution, they reflected a changing climate. The monarchy, which had once seemed untouchable, was now seen as vulnerable to public opinion. Victoria's withdrawal was central to this shift. The Queen herself did not see her actions in political terms. To her, mourning was an act of loyalty to Albert, and she believed it was her sacred duty to keep his memory alive. She also felt deeply misunderstood by her subjects. She resented the criticism and often expressed bitterness toward those who demanded her presence. In her mind, she had given the nation a devoted prince consort who had worked tirelessly for the good of Britain, and she now believed she had the right to grieve him without interference. But monarchy is never only private. Whether she liked it or not, her absence created what many described as a constitutional crisis. The crisis was not about legal structures. The monarchy was still firmly embedded within the Constitution, and Parliament continued to govern. But the monarchy had symbolic functions that could not be ignored. The crown was meant to be the visible head of the nation, a figure who transcended party politics and represented unity. When Victoria stayed away, those functions were left unfulfilled. Prime ministers, however skilled, could not replace the role of a sovereign who embodied the continuity of the state. The longer she remained invisible, the more people wondered if the monarchy itself still served a purpose. One of the key turning points came with the actions of Benjamin Disraeli, who understood the power of image and symbolism better than most of his contemporaries. Disraeli flattered the Queen, spoke warmly of her, and sought to bring her back into public life by appealing to her pride. In 1876, he arranged for her to be given the title Empress of India. This not only honored her but also tied her to the expanding empire, giving her a new role beyond her identity as Albert's widow. It was a calculated political move. By presenting her as a global sovereign rather than only a grieving wife, Disraeli sought to restore her prestige and strengthen the monarchy in the eyes of the public. The strategy had mixed results. Victoria did feel flattered and enjoyed the sense of importance that came with the imperial title. She also occasionally made more public appearances, especially at moments of national significance, such as the Jubilee celebrations. But she never fully returned to the level of visibility she had shown before Albert's death. She continued to live much of her life in seclusion, particularly in Balmoral, where she felt closest to her late husband. The public gradually accepted this, though not without complaint. Over time, the image of Victoria as the widow of Windsor became both a symbol of constancy and a reminder of her long withdrawal. It is worth noting that despite criticism, Victoria's seclusion did not destroy the monarchy. In fact, in some ways it helped shape the institution in a new direction. By removing herself from the social scene of London and from constant public exposure, she inadvertently shifted the monarchy toward a more ceremonial and symbolic role. She was less involved in politics, leaving real governance to her ministers. This suited the gradual evolution of constitutional monarchy in Britain, where the sovereign became less of a political actor and more of a unifying figurehead. While her absence was painful in the short term, it may have contributed to the long-term stability of the institution. Her later years brought some vindication. By the time of her Golden Jubilee in 1887 and her Diamond Jubilee in 1897, she had regained much of her popularity. Crowds cheered her as she appeared in public, and the earlier bitterness of the 1860s was partly forgotten. The nation had grown used to her mourning clothes and her solemn demeanor. To many, she now embodied the virtues of duty, perseverance, and dignity. The image of the widow, once seen as a sign of weakness, was transformed into a symbol of endurance. The monarchy survived, though it had been tested. The story of Victoria's grief and withdrawal remains one of the most striking examples of how the personal life of a monarch can shape the public life of a nation. Her private despair spilled into the political sphere, creating anxiety about the future of the crown. The reaction of the public shows how deeply people expected their sovereign to be visible, present, and engaged. At the same time, her long mourning demonstrates the limits of public patience. Sympathy has boundaries, and when those boundaries are crossed, even a beloved monarch can face harsh criticism. Looking back, it is possible to see Victoria's withdrawal as both a human tragedy and a constitutional drama. As a human being, she suffered a loss that anyone might find unbearable. As a queen, however, her response was bound to have consequences for her people. The interplay between those two roles is what makes her story so compelling. The widowhood of Victoria was not only a matter of personal sorrow. It was a national event that shaped politics, society, and the monarchy itself. Even after more than a century, the lessons remain clear. A monarch may wish to retreat into private life, but the crown is not a private possession. It belongs to the nation, and with it comes the duty to be present, to represent, and to endure in the eyes of the people. Victoria's grief was real, and her devotion to Albert was touching. But her withdrawal showed the risks of allowing private sorrow to overshadow public duty. The monarchy survived, yet it was never quite the same. From that point onward, it became clear that the crown depended not only on tradition and law, but also on public opinion. In a democratic age, the survival of monarchy required visibility, engagement, and a willingness to embody the spirit of the nation. After the long years of mourning that followed Albert's death, one figure came to occupy a central, and often controversial, place in Victoria's life. This was John Brown, a Scottish servant from Balmoral who had worked as Albert's gillie and later became the Queen's personal attendant. He was rough in manner, direct in speech, and entirely unlike the polished courtiers who normally surrounded the sovereign. Yet in his plainness and honesty she found comfort, and in his constant companionship she discovered a kind of stability that helped her endure the endless years of widowhood. The relationship between Victoria and Brown has been the subject of endless speculation. To some, it was an innocent bond of trust and reliance, the solace of a lonely woman who had lost her husband too soon. To others, it was something more intimate, perhaps even romantic. Whatever the truth, there can be no doubt that his presence shaped her later life and left an indelible mark on both her private world and her public reputation. Brown entered Victoria's service in the early 1860s, not long after Albert's death. At first, he was simply one of the outdoor servants at Balmoral, assisting with the Queen's excursions into the Scottish Highlands. But his forthright character and his willingness to speak plainly to her soon distinguished him from others. While courtiers tended to flatter and defer, Brown addressed her almost as an equal. He called her woman when she was obstinate, and he did not hesitate to scold her when he thought she was being unreasonable. Rather than finding this offensive, Victoria delighted in it. She valued sincerity above ceremony, and in Brown she felt she had found someone who would not deceive her. As the years passed, his role grew more significant. He became her constant companion, attending her on walks and carriage rides, protecting her with fierce loyalty, and even advising her on matters of daily routine. The closeness between the two did not go unnoticed. Members of the royal household resented his influence. Aristocrats looked down on him as a common servant who had risen above his station. Ministers worried that his hold over the Queen might affect decisions of state. More damaging still, the public began to talk. Newspapers published cartoons that mocked the relationship. Satirical verses described the Queen as Mrs. Brown. Whispers circulated that she had allowed herself to become entangled with a man far beneath her rank. For a sovereign who was already criticized for her seclusion, the idea that she was hiding away with a favored servant only deepened public disapproval. It is impossible to know the full truth of their relationship. Victoria's journals and letters show great affection for Brown, but they contain no clear evidence of romance in a physical sense. She described him as devoted, loyal, and indispensable. She relied on him in ways that went beyond mere service. He was the one person who could bring her out of her darkest moods, who could insist that she take exercise, who could tell her when she was brooding too deeply. She wrote warmly of his companionship and trusted him in a way that startled others. Some historians believe that theirs was a purely emotional bond, one rooted in gratitude and friendship. Others believe there may have been a deeper intimacy that the royal household carefully suppressed from the record. What is certain is that Victoria, who never ceased to mourn Albert, also never allowed herself to marry again. Whether she loved Brown in a romantic sense or not, she remained faithful to Albert's memory in public and in her own mind. The scandal surrounding Brown reflected broader tensions within society. The Victorian era placed great emphasis on class hierarchy and moral propriety. For a queen to be so visibly attached to a servant offended many people's sense of order. It seemed to blur the boundaries that upheld the social structure. Satirical magazines seized upon the image of the Highlander at the Queen's side, turning him into a figure of ridicule and suggesting that the monarchy had descended into absurdity. Even her own family found his presence difficult. The Prince of Wales disliked him and resented the influence he held over his mother. Court officials, who were used to managing access to the Queen, found themselves sidelined by Brown's constant attendance. His blunt manner and lack of respect for protocol only deepened their irritation. And yet, for all the criticism, Brown's presence had undeniable benefits. He succeeded in doing what ministers and relatives could not. He drew the Queen back into life. By encouraging her to ride, to walk, and to spend time outdoors, he helped restore her health and spirits. His plain speech reminded her that not everyone was impressed by her rank, and in this she found a curious relief. After years of being shielded and managed, she had someone by her side who treated her like a human being rather than a distant sovereign. This restored sense of humanity gave her strength to face the demands of her position, even if she never again embraced public life with the energy she had shown in her youth. In political terms, Brown also played an unexpected role. Ministers often despaired of persuading Victoria to act in the ways they wished. She was stubborn, and her grief had made her more withdrawn than ever. Yet Brown could influence her when others failed. His practical advice and his ability to calm her tempers sometimes smoothed relations between the Queen and her government. While he never held official authority, his informal power was real, and this both reassured and alarmed those around her. On the one hand, he helped stabilize her moods and encouraged her to engage more with affairs of state. On the other hand, his lack of position and training made ministers uneasy. The idea that royal decisions might be swayed by a servant was troubling in a constitutional monarchy already balancing tradition with modern politics. The controversy reached its height in the late 1860s and early 1870s, when criticism of the Queen's seclusion was strongest. At this time, rumors about Brown provided fuel for Republican voices who argued that the monarchy had become irrelevant and even absurd. The Queen, they claimed, was hiding with her servant while the nation's business was conducted by others. Yet in a strange way, Brown's influence may also have prevented matters from becoming worse. Without him, Victoria might have sunk even deeper into despair, perhaps retreating so far that she would never have reappeared in public life at all. His companionship kept her anchored, and though it provoked satire, it also ensured that she did not entirely abandon her responsibilities. The Queen's affection for Brown lasted until his death in 1883. His passing was another severe blow, though it did not plunge her into the same abyss of despair that Albert's death had caused. By then she had learned, however painfully, to continue without those she loved most. She had also regained much of her popularity, especially after her Golden Jubilee in 1887, which showed her once more as a symbol of national unity. Nevertheless, she never forgot Brown. She kept mementos of him, wrote of him with warmth, and instructed that memorials to him be created at Balmoral. This continued devotion ensured that the whispers about their relationship never entirely faded. The story of Victoria and John Brown illustrates the tension between the personal and the political in monarchy. To the Queen, he was simply a friend, a source of comfort, and a reminder of the life she had shared with Albert in the Highlands. To the public, however, he became a symbol of impropriety, a target for satire, and a reminder of her long withdrawal from national life. His presence exposed the vulnerability of monarchy in an age when newspapers, caricature, and public opinion could no longer be ignored. At the same time, his companionship helped sustain the Queen through one of the darkest periods of her reign, enabling her to carry on until she emerged once more into the light of public approval. It is striking that the monarchy, which depends so heavily on image and symbolism, could be both undermined and preserved by the same relationship. Brown damaged Victoria's reputation in the eyes of many, but he also gave her the strength to remain on the throne. Without him, her seclusion might have lasted even longer, and public patience might have snapped completely. With him, she endured ridicule, but she also recovered enough to face her later jubilees and to end her reign as the revered matriarch of a vast empire. In this sense, Brown was both a liability and a savior, a shadow that darkened her reputation yet also shielded her from greater ruin. When she died in 1901, the Queen was buried with tokens of both Albert and Brown. In her coffin were placed mementos of her beloved husband, but also a lock of Brown's hair and photographs of him. This final act showed the depth of her attachment and the importance he had held in her life. It also ensured that speculation about the true nature of their relationship would never end. Even in death, Victoria was shaped by the men who had given her strength. Albert, the prince consort who defined her early reign, and Brown, the Highland servant who sustained her widowhood. The legacy of this companionship is complex. It highlights the difficulty of separating the personal from the political when it comes to monarchy. It shows how grief, love, and friendship can spill into public life in ways that reshape institutions. It demonstrates the power of rumor and satire in an age when the press had become a force capable of influencing national opinion. Most of all, it reminds us that monarchs, however exalted, are human beings, subject to the same longings, dependencies, and vulnerabilities as anyone else. Victoria's bond with John Brown may never be fully explained, but it remains one of the most revealing chapters of her reign, a story in which private comfort and public scandal were inseparably intertwined. By the time John Brown's presence in Victoria's life had ended with his death in the early 1880s, the Queen was an older woman who had lived through 2 decades of unrelenting grief. Yet even as she continued to mourn Albert and to treasure Brown's memory, her role as sovereign was beginning to change in ways that neither she nor her subjects could have anticipated in the early years of her widowhood. The woman who had once hidden from the world in her black dresses, the widow of Windsor, mocked in cartoons and lampooned as absent and irrelevant, gradually emerged as something larger, something more symbolic, and something that altered the very nature of monarchy. This reinvention was not swift, nor was it entirely deliberate, but over the last decades of her reign Victoria transformed from a secluded widow into an imperial figure whose very image carried new meaning for Britain and its growing empire. One of the most important moments in this transformation came with the conferral of the title Empress of India in the year 1876. This was the work of Benjamin Disraeli, whose talent for theatrical politics matched his understanding of the need to elevate the monarchy in an age when its foundations seemed unsteady. Disraeli flattered Victoria endlessly, addressing her in terms that emphasized her grandeur and significance. He recognized that her pride could be stirred even through her grief, and he offered her a new identity that transcended widowhood. By making her Empress of India, he not only gave her a title, but also connected her personally with the crown jewel of Britain's expanding empire. For Victoria, this meant more than political symbolism. It was a reminder that her life still carried immense purpose, that she was not only Albert's widow, but also the figurehead of a vast dominion that spanned continents and peoples. This imperial title gave Victoria fresh energy. She began to take more interest in the empire, requesting detailed reports on India and encouraging visits from Indian princes. She surrounded herself with Indian servants, most famously Abdul Karim, whom she affectionately called the Munshi. Just as John Brown had been a source of companionship and controversy, so too was Karim, though the nature of his relationship with Victoria was different. For the Queen, these connections to India helped make the idea of empire personal. They also reinforced the symbolic link between her role as sovereign and the faraway lands that the British now ruled. At a time when industrialization, political reform, and shifting social structures were changing Britain itself, the imperial image provided a way for the monarchy to project stability, power, and continuity. Victoria's new imperial role also gave her the opportunity to re-enter public life in carefully managed ways. She never again returned to the level of social and political presence she had shown before Albert's death. She remained fundamentally private, deeply attached to Balmoral and Osborne, and resistant to the constant demands of London society. But now, rather than facing criticism for absence, she learned how to appear selectively, in ways that maximized her impact. Her public appearances became less frequent, but far more significant. Each time she showed herself, whether at official ceremonies, jubilees, or carefully arranged processions, it carried great weight. The people no longer expected to see her constantly. Instead, they cherished the rare glimpses they were offered, and these moments became opportunities for mass celebration and affirmation of loyalty. The role of the press was crucial in this redefinition. In the early years of her seclusion, newspapers had been harsh critics, mocking her for hiding away and calling her neglectful of her duties. But as the century advanced, the press became a partner in crafting her image. Reporters and photographers recorded her appearances, and even though she continued to wear black, the visual presentation of the Queen took on new meaning. Rather than appearing as a woman paralyzed by sorrow, she came to be seen as a figure of endurance, someone who had carried grief with dignity and remained steadfast on the throne. The very absence that had once been criticized was transformed into mystique. She became a presence precisely because she was not constantly visible. The monarchy itself was being reshaped into an institution that thrived on symbolism rather than daily governance. This was, in many ways, an unintended consequence of Victoria's personal grief. Her withdrawal had forced ministers to take on greater responsibility, reducing the political role of the sovereign. Over time, this created a monarchy that was less involved in the practical work of ruling and more focused on representing the nation ceremonially. The Queen's appearances became ritual moments of unity. Her jubilees, for instance, turned into massive public spectacles that celebrated not only her longevity, but also the strength of the empire. The Golden Jubilee in 1887 brought together dignitaries from across the world, reinforcing the idea that she was not just Queen of Britain, but Empress of a global dominion. A decade later, her Diamond Jubilee in 1897 further solidified this image, with parades and pageantry that projected imperial grandeur on an unprecedented scale. These celebrations were not only about Victoria herself. They were about the monarchy as an institution adapting to a new era. In a society that was becoming more democratic, with parliament and elected officials exercising real power, the monarchy could no longer function as a governing body. Instead, it reinvented itself as a unifying symbol, a source of continuity above the fray of politics. Victoria's long mourning inadvertently accelerated this change. By stepping back from daily politics, she allowed ministers to dominate governance, while she herself became an emblem of stability. The monarchy thus survived precisely because it was transformed. Rather than being threatened by her absence, it evolved into something that could coexist with modern parliamentary democracy. The press played a decisive role in spreading this new vision of monarchy to the public. Photographs of Victoria, often showing her in her carriage or at public ceremonies, conveyed an image of venerable dignity. Articles celebrated her as the matriarch of the nation, a motherly figure who embodied the moral seriousness of the age. The satirical attacks of the 1860s gave way to more reverential coverage by the end of the century. This change reflected not only her deliberate reinvention, but also the public's shifting attitude. By then, people no longer expected their monarch to govern. They wanted a symbol of continuity, a figure who could stand above party divisions and remind them of the deeper unity of the nation and the empire. Victoria fit that role perfectly, not because she had sought it, but because her personal grief had pushed her into it. It is worth noting how much of this reinvention depended on ritual and spectacle. Victoria herself remained shy, reserved, and uncomfortable with public speaking. Yet the ceremonial events of her later reign became central to her public identity. The Jubilees were the most famous, but other occasions, such as state visits, military reviews, and processions through London, also played their part. Each was carefully staged to present the Queen not as a politician, but as a symbol. Crowds cheered her not because she was making decisions, but because she represented their shared history, their traditions, and their pride in the empire. This was a new way of thinking about monarchy, one that relied on performance, ritual, and imagery rather than governance. It was also a model that would be inherited by her successors, and that still shapes the British monarchy today. The transformation of Victoria's reign into something imperial and symbolic also reveals the interplay between private sorrow and public identity. Her lifelong mourning was genuine, yet it became a defining feature of her image. Dressed in black, she projected an aura of solemnity that matched the seriousness of her age. To her subjects, this came to represent not weakness but resilience. She was the widow who had carried on for decade after decade, just as the nation itself endured through wars, reforms, and change. Her personal loss was thus woven into the story of the nation. The monarchy's modern identity as a symbol of continuity, rather than a center of power, was forged in those long years of grief and adaptation. By the time Victoria died in January of 1901, she had reigned for more than 63 years, the longest of any monarch in British history until Elizabeth II surpassed her a century later. The woman who had once been mocked as absent and irrelevant was now mourned as the grandmother of Europe, the matriarch of a dynasty that stretched across the continent. Her funeral was a global event, attended by kings, emperors, and presidents, a testimony to the stature she had achieved by the end of her life. The transformation was remarkable. From a young queen guided by Albert, to a widow consumed by grief, to a sovereign mocked for her seclusion, and finally to an empress who embodied the grandeur of empire, Victoria's reign was a journey of reinvention. It reshaped not only her personal image, but also the institution of monarchy itself. The legacy of this reinvention continues to matter. Victoria showed that monarchy could survive profound crisis by adapting its role. Her personal grief, which might have destroyed her ability to reign, instead became the catalyst for a new form of monarchy, less political, more symbolic, and deeply tied to ceremony and empire. The selective public appearances, the careful use of the press, and the emphasis on ritual all became tools that future monarchs would rely upon. The British monarchy in the 20th and 21st centuries owes much of its character to the transformations that took place during Victoria's widowhood. The crown endured because it learned to thrive on image and symbolism, lessons drawn from a queen who never intended to modernize, but who did so nonetheless. Thus, when one looks back on the long Victorian reign, it is impossible to separate the story of her personal sorrow from the story of national transformation. Albert's death, Brown's companionship, the whispers of scandal, the embrace of empire, the redefinition of public appearances, and the power of the press all wove together to create a monarchy that was very different at the end of the 19th century than it had been at the start. Victoria's personal journey of grief, resilience, and reinvention became the monarchy's journey as well. What began as a crisis of absence ended as a triumph of endurance, with a queen who, in her very mourning, gave the crown a new and lasting life. The reinvention of Victoria as empress, and as the ceremonial embodiment of empire, was not the only way her later years reshaped the monarchy. Alongside her transformation stood the growing network of her children, whose lives carried her influence far beyond Britain's shores. If Albert's death had shattered her private world, it also altered the way she approached motherhood and the future of her dynasty. What had once been a joint project of parenting and planning between Victoria and her beloved husband became, after his passing, a matter left to a grieving widow who clung to Albert's memory as a guiding principle. The result was both deeply personal and profoundly political, for the upbringing and marriages of her 9 children extended the reach of the crown across Europe and created a dynastic web that earned her the enduring title, the Grandmother of Europe. Albert had been deeply involved in the education of their children. He believed in discipline, duty, and a rigorous program of moral and intellectual training. He sought to raise princes and princesses who would embody both virtue and responsibility. His death in the year 1861 meant that this guiding hand was suddenly gone, and Victoria, overwhelmed by grief, was left to manage a large family while retreating into mourning. She leaned heavily on Albert's memory, invoking his wishes constantly, sometimes to the frustration of her children. To them, Albert was no longer only a beloved father, but also an unyielding standard they were told to live up to long after his passing. Victoria's constant references to what Albert would have wanted created a burden that shaped their upbringing in ways that were often stifling. Her eldest son, Albert Edward, known within the family as Bertie, was perhaps most affected by this dynamic. As the Prince of Wales, he was heir to the throne, yet his relationship with his mother was strained. Victoria blamed him, unfairly, for contributing to Albert's fatal illness. When Albert rushed to Cambridge in the last weeks of his life, it was partly to confront Bertie about an indiscreet affair the young prince had been having while in military training in Ireland. Victoria never forgave her son for this supposed stress on Albert's already fragile health. From that moment, her judgment of Bertie was harsh and unrelenting. She considered him frivolous, irresponsible, and unworthy of his father's legacy. Her grief deepened the rift, and throughout her life she withheld the trust and respect that might have prepared him better for kingship. Instead, she kept him at a distance from affairs of state, limiting his role and preventing him from gaining experience. The burden of succession weighed heavily upon him, and when he finally became King Edward VII after her death, he was already nearly 60 years old, a monarch untested in government but seasoned in social life. If Bertie bore the weight of his mother's disappointment, her daughters carried a different kind of responsibility. Victoria and Albert believed strongly in dynastic marriages as tools of diplomacy, and after Albert's death the Queen pursued this vision with renewed determination. Each daughter became, in her eyes, both a child and an instrument of foreign policy. The most significant of these marriages was that of her eldest daughter, also named Victoria, known as Vicky within the family. She was married at a young age to Prince Frederick William of Prussia, who later became the German Emperor Frederick III. Through this marriage, Victoria hoped to spread liberal and constitutional values into Prussia, guided by Albert's belief in reform and progress. But the reality was more complicated. Vicky's influence in Berlin was limited, her liberal views clashed with the more conservative court, and her eldest son, the future Kaiser Wilhelm II, developed a tense and difficult relationship with her. Thus, what had been imagined as a bridge between Britain and Germany instead sowed seeds of conflict that would later erupt in the tragedies of the 20th century. Other daughters were married into royal houses across Europe, extending Victoria's reach. Alice, her second daughter, married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse. She bore several children, among them Alexandra, who would later marry Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and become the last empress of that troubled land. Alexandra carried with her the legacy of her grandmother's devotion to family and faith, but also the burdens of nervous sensitivity and intense religiosity. Her fate in Russia, where she became a tragic figure caught in the collapse of the Romanov dynasty, showed the darker side of dynastic webs. Another daughter, Helena, married Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, binding the family to the complexities of German ducal politics. Louise, one of Victoria's more independent-minded daughters, married John Campbell, the Duke of Argyll, making her unusual among her siblings for marrying within Britain rather than abroad. Beatrice, the youngest, was kept close by her mother, who could not bear to part with her. For Beatrice, this meant a life shaped by Victoria's constant presence, even after her marriage to Prince Henry of Battenberg, with whom she continued to live near the Queen and to serve as her companion and secretary. Through these marriages, Victoria's children spread her lineage across the continent. They became queens, empresses, princes, and consorts in Germany, Russia, Denmark, Greece, Spain, and elsewhere. By the end of the 19th century, nearly every royal family in Europe was connected to her by blood. This created a network of alliances that appeared to promise peace, since rulers bound by kinship might hesitate to wage war against one another. Yet the opposite proved true. Family ties could not prevent the rise of nationalism, imperial rivalry, and militarism. When the First World War erupted in 1914, many of the leaders of opposing nations were Victoria's grandchildren: George V of Britain, Wilhelm II of Germany, and Nicholas II of Russia. The dynastic web she had spun, meant to bind Europe together, instead highlighted the tragic irony that family bonds were powerless against the forces of modern conflict. Victoria's approach to her children was shaped at every step by her grief for Albert. She often spoke of fulfilling his wishes in arranging their marriages. She viewed herself as the guardian of his legacy, and in this role she imposed her will with force. The children, however, sometimes chafed under this constant invocation of their father's memory. They longed for freedom, for affection unshadowed by duty. Some resented her strictness, while others accepted it with resignation. Yet none could escape the weight of being part of a dynastic strategy larger than themselves. Victoria's grief was not only a private sorrow, but a guiding force that extended into the shaping of Europe's future. At the same time, Victoria's mothering style was complex. She was capable of deep affection, writing tender letters to her children, and expressing pride in their achievements. But she was also demanding, controlling, and often quick to criticize. Her grief made her cling more tightly to some children, like Beatrice, while creating distance with others, like Bertie. She placed heavy expectations on all of them to uphold the values that she and Albert had cherished. This mixture of love and pressure left lasting marks. Some children grew up with a strong sense of duty and service, while others struggled under the weight of her expectations. The political consequences of these family ties were immense. The marriages arranged by Victoria helped maintain Britain's influence in continental affairs without the need for constant intervention. Her family became a diplomatic tool, a living network that reinforced alliances and shaped perceptions of Britain as a central player in European politics. Yet this strategy also tied Britain more closely to the fate of Europe's monarchies. When those monarchies came under strain in the 20th century, Britain's own monarchy had to adapt quickly to distance itself from unpopular foreign cousins. The First World War forced King George V to change the family name from the German-sounding House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the more English-sounding House of Windsor. Thus, Victoria's dynastic vision, which had once seemed to strengthen Britain, eventually created challenges for her successors. Her legacy as a mother is therefore deeply intertwined with her legacy as a monarch. The grief that shaped her private life also influenced the way she raised her children and arranged their futures. Her constant reference to Albert's wishes ensured that his ideals lived on, but it also created a rigidity that left little room for her children's independence. They became symbols of her devotion to duty and instruments of her dynastic strategy, yet they also carried with them the burdens of her sorrow. Through them, her grief extended across Europe, shaping the lives of nations as well as families. By the end of her life, Victoria could look upon a family tree that stretched into nearly every royal house on the continent. She took pride in this, often remarking on the marriages and positions of her children and grandchildren. Yet she also carried the wounds of loss. Several of her children predeceased her, including Alice and Leopold, and these deaths reopened old sorrows. She mourned them deeply, yet she endured, continuing to embody the role of matriarch to a vast dynasty. When she died in 1901, she left behind not only a transformed monarchy, but also a family whose connections would shape the fate of Europe for generations. Her children carried her legacy in ways both profound and tragic. They spread British influence across borders, but they also revealed the limits of dynastic politics in a world moving toward nationalism and democracy. They lived under the shadow of a mother whose grief never faded and whose expectations were relentless. They became the embodiment of her personal sorrow and her political vision. In them, the private and the public once again intertwined, just as they had throughout Victoria's reign. And through them, her story did not end with her death, but continued to shape the course of the 20th century, when the dynastic web she wove was tested by the fires of war and the decline of monarchy across much of Europe. Thus, the tale of Victoria's children is inseparable from the story of her own widowhood and reinvention. The same grief that made her the Widow of Windsor, and later the Empress of India, also guided her hand as a mother and matchmaker. The monarchy was modernized through her seclusion and her redefined public role, but it was also internationalized through the marriages of her children. Her legacy lives not only in the British crown that she reshaped, but also in the tangled dynastic web that made her the grandmother of Europe, a title that speaks both to her success and to the unintended consequences of her grief-driven vision. By the closing years of the 19th century, Queen Victoria stood as the embodiment of a nation and of an empire. She was no longer the young queen who had ascended the throne in the year 1837, nor the broken widow who had retreated into shadow after Albert's death. She had become instead a figure of remarkable endurance, a woman who had carried both her grief and her crown across more than 6 decades. Her reign, by its sheer length and its ability to weather crises both personal and political, had come to symbolize stability in an age of extraordinary change. Nowhere was this more visible than in the celebration of her Diamond Jubilee in the year 1897, which marked 60 years upon the throne and which transformed her in the eyes of her subjects and the wider world into an almost mythic figure. The Diamond Jubilee was not merely a royal anniversary. It was a deliberate spectacle, a moment designed to demonstrate the strength and unity of the empire over which she reigned. Preparations stretched across months, with committees arranging parades, church services, decorations, and public festivities. Dignitaries from across the empire and foreign rulers from Europe gathered to pay tribute, while streets in London were filled with flags and bunting. The empire, now reaching its height, was presented as a vast family under Victoria's matriarchal gaze. The Queen herself, though by then frail and elderly, became the centerpiece of it all. Dressed as always in black, she was wheeled in an open carriage through streets thronged with cheering crowds. The sight of this small, aged woman, bowed with years yet still bearing the weight of the crown, inspired awe and affection. Where once her seclusion had provoked satire, now her endurance commanded reverence. The Jubilee emphasized not only her longevity, but also the global reach of the empire. Soldiers and officials from India, Africa, Canada, Australia, and the Caribbean marched in processions, their presence serving as living proof of Britain's dominion. For Victoria, the imperial title conferred 2 decades earlier by Disraeli found its fullest expression. She was no longer only Queen of the United Kingdom. She was Empress of India, mother of a dynasty that stretched across Europe, and the sovereign whose reign encompassed lands and peoples on every continent. The spectacle of her Diamond Jubilee proclaimed to the world that the British monarchy had not only survived the crises of her widowhood, but had been redefined as the ceremonial heart of an empire. Public reaction confirmed the transformation of her image. Where once crowds had grumbled about her absence, now they erupted in cheers for her presence. The press, once harsh in its criticism, now published glowing accounts of her dignity and resilience. Children sang hymns in her honor, and churches held Thanksgiving services across the country. For ordinary people, the Jubilee was a chance to express loyalty not only to a monarch, but also to the idea of continuity itself. Many had grown up knowing no other sovereign. For them, Victoria was part of the very fabric of life, a reassuring constant in a world that had changed almost beyond recognition. Railways, factories, new cities, new colonies, and new inventions had transformed the nation. But the Queen had remained, year after year, decade after decade, the familiar presence at its head. Yet behind the public triumph lay the private reality of Victoria's final years. Though she had re-entered the public eye in carefully curated ways, she remained personally defined by her widowhood. Albert's memory continued to shape her daily existence. His rooms were still preserved at Windsor, his clothes carefully maintained, his presence honored in countless small rituals. She spoke of him constantly, writing in her journals of her continuing devotion and longing. Even in her conversations with ministers and children, she often invoked his opinions and beliefs, as if he still guided her from beyond the grave. Her enduring bond with Albert was not a matter of sentimentality alone. It was the foundation upon which she built her own resilience. To live as his widow was to carry his ideals forward, and in doing so, she found the strength to endure. Her personal strength in these years was quiet rather than dramatic. Age had left her frail, and she suffered from rheumatism and failing eyesight. She traveled less often and spent much of her time at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight or at Balmoral in Scotland. But even in her physical decline, she remained mentally sharp, engaged with affairs of state, and attentive to her ministers. Prime ministers such as Lord Salisbury valued her insights, even when they disagreed with her conservatism. She never became a ceremonial figure in the sense of being disengaged. She continued to read dispatches, to correspond with officials, and to express her opinions firmly. Her reign may have become more symbolic, but she herself never ceased to take her role seriously. The quiet strength of her final years was also reflected in her ability to accept loss with composure. Several of her children predeceased her, including her second daughter Alice and her youngest son Leopold. The death of John Brown in 1883 had reopened wounds of grief, and later the controversies surrounding her Indian attendant Abdul Karim stirred unease in court. Yet through each of these trials she carried on. Where once she had been nearly paralyzed by sorrow after Albert's death, she now showed an ability to endure loss with steadiness. This resilience, born of decades of mourning, made her an example to her subjects, many of whom faced hardships of their own in a rapidly changing industrial society. In her ability to carry grief without surrender, she embodied a stoic ideal that resonated with the Victorian age itself. The end of her life came at Osborne House in January of 1901. She had spent her last Christmas surrounded by family, many of whom came from across Europe to be with her. By then she was 81 years old, the longest reigning monarch in British history. Her final days were marked by weakness and fatigue, yet she remained attentive to her family and to the rituals of faith that had always sustained her. She asked to be buried not in pure white robes of ceremonial splendor, but in black, with mementos of Albert and John Brown placed in her coffin. This final act revealed the truth of her life, that beneath the crown, the titles, the ceremonies, and the empire, she remained a woman defined by love, loss, and loyalty. Her death marked not only the passing of a queen but the end of an era. The Victorian age, with its moral seriousness, industrial might, imperial expansion, and strict social codes, was inseparable from her long reign. The mourning that followed her death was immense, with ceremonies stretching across Britain and throughout the empire. Heads of state from across the world attended her funeral, a testament to the stature she had achieved. Her coffin was carried on a gun carriage, draped in the royal standard, through streets lined with silent crowds. In that moment, the nation recognized not only the loss of a monarch, but the close of a chapter in its own history. Victoria's legacy was profound. She had reigned for over 6 decades, through times of change that might have destroyed a weaker monarchy. Instead, her reign had redefined the crown for the modern age. Her long seclusion after Albert's death had shifted the monarchy away from active governance and toward a symbolic role. Her carefully managed public appearances had shown the power of ritual and spectacle in binding the nation together. Her embrace of the imperial title had transformed the monarchy into a global institution, projecting Britain's influence across continents. Her dynastic marriages had woven the crown into the fabric of European politics, even if those ties later brought tragedy. And her personal story of grief and endurance had created an image of monarchy rooted not in politics, but in character and constancy. This reinvention shaped the British monarchy for the century that followed. Later monarchs, from George V to Elizabeth II, would inherit the model she had created. A sovereign who ruled less through political authority and more through presence, ritual, and continuity. The monarchy became, under her example, an institution defined by visibility and symbolism rather than power. It adapted to democracy not by resisting change, but by embodying permanence in the midst of it. Victoria's unseen life, as her years of seclusion were often called, had inadvertently pointed the way forward. By withdrawing from constant political activity, she created space for the monarchy to survive in a new age. Globally, her image as Empress of India and as matriarch of a vast family established the monarchy as a symbol of empire. This legacy was complicated, for the empire itself would eventually decline and leave behind questions of colonialism and inequality. Yet in her time, it gave the monarchy a global stature that made it unique among European thrones. Even as republics rose and other monarchies fell, the British crown endured, fortified by the imperial identity she had embraced. The global image of monarchy as both ancient and modern, ceremonial yet powerful, owed much to her reign. At the same time, her story revealed the human side of monarchy. Her devotion to Albert, her dependence on Brown and later Karim, her controlling yet affectionate relationship with her children, and her lifelong struggle with grief showed her as a woman as well as a sovereign. This humanity, though often criticized in her lifetime, became part of her enduring appeal. People could see in her not only the grandeur of empire, but also the struggles of an individual who bore private sorrow while carrying public responsibility. It was this combination of the personal and the political that made her reign so significant, and that shaped the monarchy in ways that lasted far beyond her own life. Thus, the end of Victoria's reign was both a conclusion and a beginning. It closed the chapter of the 19th century, the age that bore her name, but it also opened the path for the modern monarchy that would navigate the 20th. Her Diamond Jubilee had demonstrated the monarchy's power as a symbol of unity and empire. Her final years had shown the dignity of endurance and the depth of human feeling that underlay her crown. And her death marked the end of an era that would forever be remembered as Victorian. The legacy she left was not only of empire and dynasty, but of a redefined crown, one that had survived crisis and sorrow to emerge as an enduring institution in a changing world.